In this video, we're going to focus on editing applique designs, and you'll notice that I have the same design open that we were working with before when we learned how to create the applique stitches. And so some of the things that we're going to focus on is first, I'm going to zoom in here. We're going to look at editing it, and there's two ways of editing where you can edit the shape, and then the next thing is editing the properties. So editing the shape is just like editing a run stitch, basically, where you can click on the points and you can drag them. You can change the type by right clicking and going to cusp, smooth, symmetrical, deleting a point, adding a point, the basic editing things that you can do. And so if you're not familiar with that, make sure you look at editing a run stitch, and that's basically what you get for editing an applique shape. The start and end point is basically what you're going to be working with most, is editing that, where it starts and where it ends. And typically you have it start and end at the same spot when you're doing applique. So let's take a look at the properties. And the properties box over here, when you have something selected, I'm going to click off of this background here. Some of the things that you can change are the type of border. And before we get into that though, let's go ahead and take a look in the sequence view. And just as a refresher from creating it, when you use the applique tool, it automatically creates a placement line, a tack down line, and a border. It automatically creates those. And let's go ahead, and I'm just, for the sake of it, I'm going to copy this one and I'm going to paste it into a new page. And the only reason I'm doing that is to kind of isolate it so you can see this better here. The other thing that you'll notice is you have notes, and these are automatically put in, and these are great. This really helps a lot, because if I go to print preview, as long as I have the setting here, if I go to settings, this print notes and color analysis, as long as I have that checked, it's going to actually put those notes in here. And the notes actually tell you, before proceeding, place the fabric over the top of the placement line, which just stitched, before moving on to the tack down. And then after you do a tack down stitch, it tells you what you need to do. And if you're working with a complex design, this can be really helpful, because there can be 30 different color sequences, and it could happen at color sequence 15 and you might not notice it. So having the printing off that sheet and having those notes there are really, really nice. And but like I said, it does that by default when you use the applique stitch tool. And you can go back and watch how to create the applique stitch tools. So in this one, in editing, so you have a placement, tack down, and a border. Right here on this applique type in the properties box, this is where you choose what type of a border is used. Default is a satin. You can change that to a blanket, and this is what a blanket stitch looks like. It basically goes up and over. It kind of just goes in that motion. If I do a slow redraw, you'll be able to see how it creates that blanket stitch. The other option you have is to do a motif. So you can select any of the motifs that you want and apply that to the edge as well. So that might be something that might be of interest to you. It can create a unique look. Satin is usually the most popular. So let's take a look here now. Applique width is the width of this satin stitch. So if I want it to be a 4, I can change that, hit apply, and it's going to make it 4 millimeters wide. I can go down to 2. I don't recommend going too small. Typically when you're doing applique and you're needing to cover up the fabric, a lot of times I like to say go at least 3.5. That'll make sure, and even up to 4. Next thing you have is the density. So the density is the tightness of the stitches. 0.4 is what I recommend. It'll cover the fabric nicely and it won't show it through the stitches. The other thing you have is the applique inset. If I click and drag this line, you notice that that outline that you can see is right in the middle of the satin stitch. And that's because this is set at 50%. If I change this to like 15 and hit apply, notice that that line changes, and notice where it's positioned. Now it's 15% on the inside and 85% to the outside of the line. That's kind of how this works. So typically, if you're going to cut the fabric yourself and you're not using a fabric cutter, you want to be about 50%. If you use a fabric cutter and you have the fabric cut to the exact size before you lay it down, you might want to go to something like 80 to 85. And that means it'll be 80% on the fabric, the stitch, and 15% off of it. I don't recommend something like this if you're going to cut the fabric yourself, because you will see a lot of fabric cut out or stick out if you cut the fabric yourself after you tack it down. 50 is what you want to use for that. And then you have the corner type. This is the corners right here. Anytime the satin stitch turns a corner, it's set at sharp. You can do bevel and hit apply, and you can see how that affects the line there. You could do round, and you can see just kind of what it's doing there. Let's go back to sharp and hit apply. And because it can be affected over here in the corner section, this other tab right here, set at miter. If I go to auto and hit apply, you can see that it did change a little bit. It changed right here. If I go to undo, you can see how it changed that corner type to a capped corner. You can do auto turn, which I wouldn't recommend because this is pretty tight here. You can do lapped, and that's just going to overlap a little bit. You have to be careful sometimes. Whenever you do this, you might have to move a start point and an end point and just play with it a little bit, because sometimes it will do some weird things like that. But I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to go to mitered and hit apply. That's what it was set at. And just showing you that you can change the corner types. And this is always also why I generally create my own border stitch outside of the applique tool, so that I can control exactly how these angles take place. And I'll show you that a little bit. So the other things you have here is you have a checkbox for sew placement, sew tack down, and sew finish. So you can choose to turn some of those off. If you didn't want the finish stitch, you can uncheck it, and that's the border stitch. Like if you were going to create your own, you could just uncheck it, and there you go. You can now digitize your own border that goes around, or you can bring it back on. You can turn off the placement, the tack down. You can turn them all off, but you have no stitches at that point. But I could do a placement, I could do the tack down, and then I can add the border. So by default, they're all three on. You do have the ability to change that. So really quick though, coming back, if we go to blanket, you'll notice that your options do change. And the blanket type, remember, is like this. Basically, you can control the width. You might go down to like a 3, and it will just shorten that length there. Blanket density will control how far apart these are. You might want to go to 2.5, and you might want to have those closer together, and you can see how that works. If you go to motif, it's the standard motif settings. So you have a motif stitch length. You have the pattern itself. So let's go ahead and choose a pattern. This one will be kind of weird, I know. But then you can change the stitch length. You can change the motif size. So I can make it larger if I want by changing it right there. You might want to have it a little bit longer of a stitch length. That can affect things though. So you can just see that you can adjust, and you can make things really kind of crazy and big as a motif around the edge. I just want to show you those settings really quick. It does change depending on what you have selected. Let's go over to Applique Extra. This is kind of like having a Run Extra tab for the run stitch, where you can now really kind of get into the nitty gritty of the applique, and it gives you more setting options. So this is what I like to get into. Stitch length here. You might want to do your placement stitch at a different stitch length. This one's fine for me. The tack down is where I'll generally make some changes at times. So right now the offset is at 0, meaning when you create the applique design using the applique tool, it's going to do the placement stitch on that exact line you create. Okay, so it's not going to offset it any, and that's what you want. You can offset it if you want. Like I could go a 0.5 millimeters if I wanted to, but the tack down is where generally, especially if you pre-cut your fabric, you definitely want to offset it into the negative. And what that does is it brings the line in a little bit so that after you lay the fabric down and you go and you cut it, or after it's pre-cut and you lay it down, it's going to go on the inside of that fabric to make sure that it actually grabs the fabric. If you did it at 0 offset and it did it on the exact size of what the pre-cut fabric was, it wouldn't grab it and it wouldn't tack it down. So something to keep in mind there. That's why the default is set at what it is. So you can change it. You can make it a little bit more. You can make it indent a little bit more. And let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Here's the placement. And I did it 0.7 instead of 0.5. So this tack down is going to be now inside of this placement by 0.7 millimeters. See how that works? So if you pre-cut your fabric to size, this will just help make sure that it fits right. And so that's kind of how that works. A lot of times, if I am cutting it myself, like I do a placement, I lay the fabric down, I tack it down. A lot of times I will, I'll do this tack down at the exact same offset at 0 because I don't really need to indent it. But at the same time, a lot of times I'll come down and I'll choose maybe a 1.8 stitch length, a small stitch length. And that might seem weird to some people, but the reason that I like to do that is it really locks it down and it makes sure that it doesn't pop out of the edges, so you don't see that little run stitch kind of poke out. The shorter that stitch is, the less likely it's going to do that. It's really going to lock it down pretty nice too. It's not often that I go to a short stitch length, but I will do it in applique a little bit. So that's your settings there. We already talked about the cornering, and the only other options you really have are when you work with a tie-in and a tie-off stitch. So by default, you definitely want to tie it in and tie it off, unless you're going to start something else right at the end of one. But that just makes sure it doesn't unravel. And so you always want to use a tie-in and tie-off. That's put in there by default. So that kind of covers the settings for an applique. And what I want to do is just kind of show you some of the things that I will do from time to time to get different results. So this works with like basically a steel stitch here. So you're at the mercy of what a steel stitch does for cornering. And so that may or may not work for you if you're like me and you want a little bit more control over that. What I'll do a lot of times is I'll copy and paste this and I'll turn it into artwork. And then what I'll do with that artwork is I will make it like a 3.5 millimeter width, which is like what I would actually make the satin stitch border. And I might even go all the way up to 4. It's not uncommon for me to use a 4, but just look at what this does by doing that. Basically what I've done is created a template for myself to go and digitize over the top of so I can control exactly how these corners are handled. I do this quite often. And if I come back over to here and I put it right in the middle of it, you can see that this one comes into a point more. This one won't do that quite as much if I do it myself. So if I'm going to do that, this is what I would do. I would come over to the applique and I would turn off the finish stitch and hit apply. That way it goes away, but at the same time, I can see the other stitches. I might need to move it on top of here. But you can see those other stitches are there, and one is right on top of the other because I chose to arrange it that way. I could go back and do the negative 0.5, and you'll see that that tack down is now on the inside. And you might even go all the way to the negative 0.7. But this will allow you to see the lines. And so I use this just as a template, and I just grab my satin tool and I just digitize over the top of it, and I'm controlling exactly where the corners are, how they behave. And so it just allows me to get a much cleaner look. And so I'm just showing you that as an option that you can still utilize the Applique tool to kind of break it apart and give you the template that you need. So as you can see, I'm just kind of controlling the angles, and that's one of the things that you can do, and that's how I do it most of the time. It's not necessary though, but you can do it that way. So that's how you can work with an applique. I know I went kind of fast through it, but that's a great thing about a video. You can replay it over and over again. So I hope that this helps and helps you get to where you can learn how to edit your appliques and get them to work for you the way that you need them to work. And that's the whole key to it. One last thing that I will say is that applique is nothing more than a placement, a tack down, and a border, meaning it's just a run stitch for a placement, a run stitch for a tack down, and then like a steel stitch, satin stitch for the border. So you don't have to use the applique tool. You can create it yourself. You don't have to. You can create your own placement, your own tack down, and your own border. The important thing is that you just have each, and that you make sure the border stitch covers so that the fabric doesn't poke out. And I just wanted to end on that note so that you know that you don't have to use the applique tool. It's there for you. Most of the time, I'll do what I showed you there, or I just create them all the lines myself, and it's easy enough to do. So I hope that helps, and we'll see you in the next video.